Welcome to another episode of Colubrid and Colubroid Radio. I believe this is episode 12, and our guest today is no stranger to podcasts. Dr. Travis Wyman is with us for this episode, and I know Matt and I are excited because we're going to be talking about oddballs today. In particular, we're going to be talking about the Asiatic Kukri snakes and the African beaked snakes. But before we get into that, we're just going to give you our updates like we do at the beginning of every show. So, how you feeling, Matt?
Oh, man, I feel like I have a vice on my head. It's funny how weather affects so many different principles of physiology. But, coming from 70 degrees to 30 degrees overnight really puts a number on your sinuses.
Yeah. Matt warned me earlier before we started recording that he may be a little loopy for this one. So, got to forgive him. Everybody gets sick. Sorry, bud. Have you still been doing your chaotic nomadic lifestyle? Is that a contributing factor to this?
No, not so much. I really think it's just the weather, to be honest with you. But next week I'll be in East Michigan, West Michigan, and then following week I'll go from Wisconsin to Illinois to Kentucky. So it's been quite the trip, if you will.
Yeah. I've been home for a couple of weeks since the Florida trip. And then next week's the big trip. I have a graduate student who is part of our zoo science grad program. And she wanted to do her master's degree on sloths. And I was like, okay, we can do that. So she's going to be studying enrichment strategies for sloths. And that required us to find a lot of sloths. And the best place to find a lot of sloths is somewhere in Central or South America. So Hale, and then one of my other graduate students, Aaron, and I are heading to Costa Rica for 8 days. And I'm going to be vetting a potential field site for future research. The first half of the trip, we're dropping Hale at the sloth sanctuary. And then on the return, later part in the week, I'll be hanging out with Hale, Aaron, and a ton of sloths. So should be an interesting week. I'll report back to what we find. And that first half, we're obviously going to be out we're not going to a jungle per se. We're going to the dry forest on the Pacific slope. So the herp diversity isn't the highest it could be. But, when I can go out and potentially find a black-tailed crebo, a boa constrictor, a neotropical rattlesnake, hognose viper, that's really not a bad day. So that's next week. And hopefully we stumble into some stuff. But it's been kind of nice, I have to admit, being home for like 2.5, 3 weeks. I know you don't know the feeling, but anyway, getting kind of settled. Yesterday was maddening trying to get all the grading I had backed up into grade books and making tests for this coming week. So I'm happy that we are here today to talk about some snakes because I'm definitely ready to just chill out a little bit before, the madness of leaving the country hits me. So I guess herp updates, snake updates. At the beginning of last episode, I mentioned how my Lamprepeltis, the king snake addiction, nothing was really happening. And it was like they heard me because within 24 hours of me making that statement, I checked and I had breeding all over the place. So I should absolutely be producing Florida Kings. I don't know how I wouldn't have produced Florida Kings, but now it's just nice to know that confirmed locks have been observed. We've got various Pitchophis breeding at the university, corn snakes out the wazoo. Hognose snakes, definitely going to be producing those. And hopefully by the time I get back from this trip, my second clutch of false water cobra eggs is on the ground. One of my ladies had her prelay shed, and they're kind of funky. They'll shed, and then usually they'll lay within 2 weeks of that shed. But this particular individual has gone up to 4 post prelay shed, and that gets a little bit, you start immediately thinking about egg binding at the end of that second week, and then the end of the third week, you're like, oh God, do we have 24 eggs stuck up in there? And then usually about the time when I'm not sleeping over it, we walk in and to school and there's a perfect clutch of like 20 plus eggs sitting in the enclosure. So I'm trying to calm myself down and just accept the fact that this is her way of doing things. So anyway, so we have that. And then other thing I feel like is worth discussing is I don't know, it was 2 episodes ago, maybe 3. I mentioned that I had a blotched king snake die in brumation, a big female. And I put a post up on our Facebook page about it and put it in a couple places, and it's been shared a bunch, and a lot of people are messaging me about it. But basically, this animal, I bought her sight unseen in the October Tinley show, and the guy who picked her up for me said she's fat. I mean, she's like got rolls, and I thought, well, that could be no, that's not a good thing. But maybe she's not as fat as we thought she was. And then I got her, and she was definitely obese. And when she died, I thought, what the hell? I'll just see how big her fat bodies were. And the images that I put up, you can see they basically go from her cloaca to her throat. And her reproductive tract. I didn't put pictures up of this because I wanted to confirm I knew what I was looking at before I blasted it across the interweb. But I'm fairly positive, like her fallopian tubes, oviducts, ovaries, that whole reproductive system was also just loaded with adipose tissue. So most of the people are like, thank you. Some people retaliated and said that you're promoting this our snakes are too fat, don't feed your snake mentality that's rolling around the hobby right now. And I'm certainly not doing that. I'm just simply letting people know this is what happens when you feed a king snake 1 or 2 mice a week for its entire life. Like, you just can't do that. So some people asked and requested that we do a feeding episode or just talk about the physiology of how snakes digest and ontogeny and all that. And I was thinking that's probably worth doing. And I thought, given your background, Matt, that would be something you'd be into. So I don't know. You think we should do that?
Yeah, I think it'd be an interesting episode, especially the way that fat accumulates in reptiles, as it's very different from humans.
Yeah, completely different process. It's used for a completely different thing. So expect that sometime, I'm going to say, in the next year. I'm not going to hold us to any time frame given the lives that we live. So, but that's my updates and the pod's update. So you have anything to report?
Well, I mean, for the most part, I've been pairing a number of animals this year. I've really cut back on pairings this year, specific to different species of which animals I wanted to produce. Something of which, goes into the ethics and morality of breeding reptiles, right? In terms of selectively breeding, but also sometimes animals need an off cycle too as well. Something that I think from the physiology of these animals, more than likely, these animals aren't breeding every year in the wild. And it's something we take for granted in terms of the length of captive husbandry for each one of these species. So really been kind of focusing on that nature. Did receive the first clutch of cock's-eye eggs for this year last night, which was pretty cool, coming home and going through things. But it's one of those things that, we've talked about too in terms of barometric pressure, right? And that jump, if you will, from that barometric pressure likely pushed that animal because that animal hadn't even done her pre-lay shet either.
Oh, wow.
So really something interesting too, and notable at least to pay attention to your animals, especially during breeding season, especially during some of those cycles. Other than that, it's just been compact with kind of traveling, coordinating things. These next 2 weeks are pretty booked up. Interviewing someone at our corporate offices for the open position I have. We also have an open position in the Twin Cities area in Minneapolis, if anyone's looking for a position that relates to science and hands-on science too as well. Try to do something Zach does and promote something outside of the podcast. Yeah. But other than that, these next 2 weeks, I'll be traveling with one of our mobile labs where we'll be visiting customers specific to microscopy, hardness testing, elemental analysis, So it'll be really fun because the mobile lab is fully functional, and my job is basically working in what I call, dirty jobs, if you will, because in this bus, you'll go anywhere from a food processing plant, a dog food manure plant, a steel mill, an automotive facility. So it's really cool to see all those different types of applications take suit.
Awesome.
But yeah, so it'll be fun. 2 weeks, jam-packed with visits and travel throughout the Midwest region, but that's kind of what I signed up
Exactly.
for. So.
Yeah.
But other than that, I mean, it's just, my weekends are kind of my sanctuary time where I spend a lot of time in the snake room, cleaning, feeding, and then checking things during the week when I am home, because that is an important aspect when you have a larger collection. You need to monitor things appropriately and coordinate things associated to that.
Heck yeah. I don't know. Here's a question. So when you leave, is there anybody in the house that kind of just, I don't want to say checks the animal. So when I leave, my wife has the best sense of smell ever, which is insanely unfortunate for me. Like, I'm talking, a mouse sits in a cage for less than 24 hours, just starts to begin the decom process. And I'm getting text messages and phone calls and like something's, and it seems like whenever I leave on a big trip, by me being trip, I mean, I'm gone for like 5-6 days. It's almost like the snakes are like, bah, this is the day we regurgitate on the first day he's gone.
Yeah.
Literally. So is there so I am trying to get my son, who's 13, to be able to save this for both of us and just deal with the damn mouse. Do you have anybody to do that, or is it just let her ride and it is what it is? Because, let's be real. Everybody that has snakes, a large collection of snakes, more than 10 snakes, this happens. This is just the nature of the beast. Doesn't mean you're a bad keeper. I mean, we as human beings might eat something one day that we've eaten our entire lives and just doesn't sit right, so we got to get rid of it. So that's just a fun little aside.
So I do have a friend that actually monitors and checks in during the week if I'm gone for 5 days in a row. But typically I won't feed animals if I know I'm going to be gone more than 72 hours.
Oh, there you go.
And so I do that purely because if an animal is going to regurgitate, it would likely be within that 72-hour time frame. So I do typically coordinate that. So for instance, I'm feeding today, I'm gone Monday, I'll be home Tuesday, and then I'll be gone Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and back Friday afternoon.
Gotcha.
So it works out. But I've been down that road before where you come home and it's like, what happened while I was gone?
Exactly.
Especially, in our conversations with many of the personalities that we've had on, most people now have an understanding that colubrids do typically feed potentially more frequently, which means their digestive tract is running a little bit more frequently. So it's something to pay attention to. But, planning and coordinating things of that nature, I think, play an important part when you travel for work. Clint Bartley we've had on. Clint travels for work too, but he does have someone that watches after his collection, including his wife. He kind of checks in on animals periodically while he's traveling. My biggest fear is actually water.
Yeah. And
because water can build up bacteria, which leads to mouth rot, leads to another number of other aspects. Typically, even when we see some of the pictures related to bacteria infections on the skin, the epidermis of snakes, especially in rhino rat snakes, it's typically the animal had gotten too cold, its enclosure was too wet, or there was bacteria within the water itself.
Interesting.
So
I guess
it's something. Yeah,
I do something similar and didn't even realize it because I knew I was going to be gone for the week, and it's like, well, normally I do all the feeding on Saturday and Sunday because obviously that's the day off. But I did the feeding on Thursday night. Yeah, I got home and was like, oh God, I don't want to deal with this, but I dealt with it. And so all the animals got fed so that they could get, if they're going to regurge, they usually do it within 48 hours. So, and I have one king snake here right now that I've tested her multiple times for crypto. She does not have crypto. She does not have giardia. I don't know what the hell. I just think that she's got a sensitive stomach. I mean, that's literally it. But she's my sneak puker. So, I'm like, all right, it's been days. And then sure enough, and that's the one that got me earlier in the week. So anyway, she's been fed her small prey items. They're down. So I think we're good to go. So hopefully this trip I'm gone. The only thing that worries me is I've got a bunch of grow outs. And I do like to kind of keep them on a normal feeding schedule. So those are the only things that I am going to feed today. And I don't leave till Monday. So hopefully, if anything's going to happen, nothing's been going down with them. Knock on wood. So anyway, all right. That was a fun little bit of Colubrid keeping.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think we're ready to move on to introduce our guest. You cool with that?
I'm good.
Alrighty. So we are pleased to have how will we say this? Visiting professor for both THP and NPR when it comes to all things genetics, Dr. Travis Wyman, with us today. Travis has done several podcasts where he enlightens us in the role of genetics and morphs, and I've learned quite a bit from listening to Travis's podcast about that subject, because I'm not really a morph guy, but that doesn't mean I don't like the biology behind it. I think it's pretty cool. But for this episode, I thought it would be cool to focus on two of Travis's loves and have an oddball focused pod today. And so what we're going to be talking about with Travis is Kukri snakes, which he's definitely known for within the hobby, genus Oligodon. And then if we have time at the end, we're going to slide in there some Ramphiophis, the beaked snakes, which he's also known for keeping because he talks about them all the time whenever he's on podcasts. So with that being said, Travis, how are we doing?
We're doing all right, gentlemen. How are you this morning?
We're good. We're talking about snakes. We're not at work. So,
This is a positive.
Yes, this is a positive. Okay. So normally at this point, we do the kind of classic, how did you get your start in reptiles? But Travis has been on so many podcasts that if you just kind of dive into the library of some of those, you can certainly find out how he got his origin story with this. But it's very similar to, Matt and I, where basically your classic biology-oriented kid / let's just be real, geek that really liked, all things reptile. So what I thought we would do is, rather than ask that question, we can ask the question of why colubrids? What about, I know that you have boas, the rubber boas and the calibars. You obviously keep pythons with the ball pythons and the genetics. And I think you even have a scrub rolling around your house right now that's not loose. It's in a cage.
It's in a cage.
But when you have that kind of diversity, obviously the colubrids are going to be scratching an itch that maybe the other species don't. So let's just talk a little bit about your general, why you keep colubrids, what about colubrids you like compared to other snakes, what niche they fill in your collection.
Well, I actually kind of started with colubrids. So my first snake was a corn.
Okay.
And then when I finally started, diversifying out and getting into more snakes than just having one or two, I had what I called my holy trinity, which was a chondro, a gray-banded king, and a blackhead. And I lucked into a chondro because I just happened to, through my other random hobby of carnivorous plant keeping, met up with a guy at Atlanta Botanical who was also a carnivorous plant and herper guy, and he had a chondro that he was moving out, so I picked that up. And then when I got that, I was like, I'm an adult now and I can do these things. I'm going to try and complete this trinity of 3 snakes that I have always really enjoyed. And so I immediately dove into what's the next thing I can find. And blackheads at the time, when you're a grad student, money is not throwing $3,000, $3,500 at a blackhead is not really an option for a grad student. But, throwing a couple hundred to get an Alterna was not out of my league. So I tracked down a really nice black gap animal that I enjoyed and picked her up, and I still have her. And that snake has been a little bit through the ringer. 5 years ago, she developed a kidney tumor. I sent her to a vet friend of mine. He plucked that out, sent her back to me after she'd recovered a bit, and she's still going strong. Never got a chance to breed her before that, and I'm not going to breed her now because that's just a stress that I don't want to put on her, but she's still trucking along. Later, I picked up an Anery male, so I've got them, and then I just have always kind of plunked along looking at other weird and different things. The ball pythons I got into because, I like to play with genetics, and that's fun. But I still had that soft spot for colubrids and oddball things. And so I would always dig around in those little weird corners of Morph Market, and digging around in those weird corners of Morph Market, one day I saw the Tioman Island Kukris, and I kind of went, I need this because they just look cool. For those who aren't familiar with them, the Tioman Islands are bright red, like just fire engine red snakes with sort of golden orangey banding on them. And I don't know what, it really caught my eye and struck a fancy with me. So I talked to the guys at Outback who had them at the time, and it wasn't fast enough on the draw, but they knew that I was looking. So when they then got some imports in, which are the mainland brown form, they gave me a call, and I went down to a show to check them out and came back with a trio of those. And at the same time, they had just gotten a bunch of African imports in, and they showed me some beaked snakes, and I was really impressed with the adults they had. And then they pulled out a little cup that had a couple of captive hatched babies from a gravid female that had come in and dropped, and they intrigued me enough to pick those up at the same time. So I came home with 5 new snakes to play with, and kind of the rest of history.
Yeah.
So Travis, if you don't mind me asking, I mean, other than those 2, do you have any other oddball colubrids laying around your house?
No, not right now. I lie. I have a Scaphiophis that I'm trying to acclimate in that is being very resistant to wanting to do that, but given how high stress they are, that's not a huge surprise. And generally they come in kind of rough, so getting them established is a bit of a difficult process. I have also tried to establish some Mesidon, and unfortunately found out that they, like indigos, are hypersensitive to external treatment for parasites. So put a tiny bit of frontline on your hands with gloves and wipe it on the snake. Yeah, that causes massive neuronal issues with them. So all of mine crashed rapidly after that. So unfortunate learning experience there, but basically nobody had ever really kept Mesidon that I could find. And so I was taking a stab in the dark and didn't get very far with them. But if I ever get the opportunity to try those again, I probably will. And this time I will find a different way to externally treat them for topical ectoparasites.
Travis, that's an interesting point. And I just want to comment off of that too as well, because with the interest over the years in file snakes, especially wild caught animals, being at the price point of which they are, they also do not respond very well to any type of topical treatment, as well as the use of prevenamite. Even being around, they're very sensitive to a number of different aspects of that. So I think that's very courageous of you to provide that information, because it's something as keepers we need to be aware of too as well.
Yeah, it's going back to what Zach was saying about that king that he got that was just a fat obese monster. There are aspects of this hobby that just aren't pretty. It does a lot more to share that, so that we learn. Hiding it behind closed doors doesn't do anybody any favors. Do I feel like shit when I end up with a dead animal or 5 dead animals? Yeah, I do. But this is how we learn. So yeah. Did all my Mesoodon die? Yeah, they did. Did they all get massive neuronal symptoms and start convulsing and twitching a day after I treated them with the front line? Yeah. So I would rather people know that I did that, because I was operating in the dark. How would anybody else know? Now it's out there. Now people know. If anybody else gets them in, okay, I need to treat them with something. But I remember that Travis said that all of his crashed after he did this, so I need to look at a different technique or a different methodology for how to treat them. And this is how we learn. This is how we go forward, and this is how we grow. It's a mistake, but it's not a mistake that I'm going to hide and shuffle away, because better that I learn and get it out there for everybody else to learn too, than to have it stored away in a little box that I hide under the bed, and then the next person who tries also kills them, and the next person who tries also kills them, and then what we have is, well, nobody can get these established. They're just trash snakes. I don't think they're trash snakes. I think they'd be very, very cool to have in the hobby. I just think we need to learn, and that's the way it is with a lot of these oddballs. Is they're so rarely kept, and most of what you're getting is imports, that there's a really steep learning curve.
Yeah. And if you're trying to establish those, I know Matt has lots of experience down this line. As soon as you start to let the thought creep into the back of your brain, like, okay, I think they're good, that's when something happens. So I had, we'll just keep going with this little tangent and we'll get back to Kukris. But a lot of people know that I had the Erythrolamprus typhus, the velvet swamp snakes, I think is the common name.
Swamp snakes, yeah.
And I was literally just snagging every one that I could see. I have none currently, because every single one of them, I acquired 4 or 5 of them, would reach this point where they were taking mice or tilapia pieces. They had great body condition. Everything looked fantastic. They were eating on their own. They were really easy to assist feed, but I always wondered, like, how much stress am I causing by grabbing this snake by the back of the head and putting this thing in its mouth as this large hairless monkey, and then putting it in a plastic bin and shutting the door. Like, I know that doesn't happen in Suriname. So anyway, but all of them got to a point where they were doing what I would think constituted great. I never got to a point where I could do any medications on them, because I just wanted to get them going. And each one of them just randomly opened the drawer dead. So that project has now had a pin put in it, and other people can go down that path. But I will flat out say, and it's in the book, in the Erythrolamprus chapter, that when you think everything is okay, there's so many things going on inside that snake you cannot see, that it's effectively doing a really good job of letting you think it's okay and healthy. From its perspective, I'm a prey item that can flee, so maybe leave me alone. But ultimately, they just all crashed out. And now the other guys, the Poecilogyres, what the hell do we call those things in the hobby? The yellow-bellied Paraguayan water snakes, I think that's what we call them. They're doing great. Like, in fact, right here is showing them. This is like the prize of my collection. It's a freaking male. It took me 1.5 years to find a male. And once you get a male, those things drop, 50 eggs a year. Yasser has been it's with Spitfire, has been very successful with them. He's the only guy I know of that has a male other than that one in that box. So anyway, more on that later.
Which is crazy. I think I had 3.2 at one point, and I was like, oh, I just need to move on from these because they're fish eaters, and I didn't feel like defrosting fish all the time.
They kind of vaporize,
now
man.
You can hardly find it.
So, okay.
I mean, that's what happens. Things come in fits and starts. People get interested, then they die off. People get interested, and then they die off. I mean, we're seeing that with a lot of things. Calibars. I remember seeing Calibars all the time, like 10, 12 years ago, and then they just dropped off the planet. And they started coming in again within the last year or so, I guess 2 or 3 years. And, with my interest in rubber boas, when I started seeing them again, I was like, I got to get these because they're basically just African rubber boas. And so I started picking them up, and we're seeing another boom with those. They're turning up all over the place now.
Interesting.
So fits and starts.
Okay. So back to Kukris.
Back to Kukris. Back to Kukris and word Colubrids.
Yes. So when you
Colubroids.
brought your Kukris home, how did you go about getting them established since they were imports? And I think it's a fair statement that the majority of them in the hobby are imports. Is that fair or not fair?
It depends.
Okay.
So there are a couple of people who are breeding them. The ones that are being bred the most are the Tioman Island, which are the bright red ones that I mentioned. So if you're seeing red ones, those are absolutely captive bred. Tioman shut their borders back in, I want to say, 97. So you cannot get wild caught Tiomans. So if you're seeing a bright red Kukri, that's a captive bred for sure. If you're seeing the brown ones, those are most likely going to be imports, especially if they are adults.
Gotcha.
Very few people have been breeding the mainland forms. I have a small clutch of eggs from 2 mainland animals incubating right now. I had some last year. Gravid female just dropped after she came in, and those eggs incubated out. Any of the brown ones that you see are going to be captive or are wild caught animals. If you find the brown babies, those are probably going to be captive hatched. Maybe 1 or 2 people are producing fully captive bred animals that way, but most people don't really find as much interest in the brown ones, so they're not breeding them as much.
Cool.
I thought the brown ones were cool.
Yeah.
Oh, I like the brown ones too. I mean, my collection right now is 2.3, and 3 of them are brown and 2 of them are red. So,
well, that's a good point. Before we get into the husbandry and all that, what makes a Kukri snake cool? Let's just do a little bit of their biology because we haven't actually talked about how they got their name, where they live. So let's just kind of cover that natural history piece right now. So there has to have been something when you were investigating Oligodons, the genus, where you were like, okay, after learning this, these things need to be in my house. So what led you to that conclusion?
All right. So, like I said, first it was just the look of them. They almost look, I don't know, they're kind of viperish looking, while still having that very colubrid body shape. Then I started reading up on them and about what they were and everything, and it just became kind of I need these because they're just too damn weird. So the generic name for them, Kukris, the common name for them, comes from the Indian Kukri dagger, which is a knife that's got sort of a bent, swept back blade. And they get that name because they have 3 enlarged teeth in the back of their jaws on each side that have that similar kukri shape. And what they use those teeth for is kind of gruesome in a lot of different ways. They use them to open eggs, mainly reptile eggs, but they can also open bird eggs through cantilever action. They also use them. There's a paper out where they will go up to larger animals that are larger than they could reasonably swallow. In this case, they were talking about toads. They slice the toad open along its belly or its flank using that tooth. Then they crawl in and eat the organs of the toad and then just leave the outside of the toad as a little empty husk, which is great if you're dealing with something like a cane toad that's toxic and will kill you, because now you're not eating the toxic part of the toad. But they will also do that with just basically any prey item that is large enough that they can't swallow it, but they can get into it. They will also scavenge that way. Almost 10 years before that toad report came out, there are captive observations of a guy in Germany who tried to feed his animals frozen thawed mice that were too big.
Oh, God.
But the snake, the same way, it gutted the mouse and just ate all the organs out and left the little empty husk of the mouse behind.
That's endearing.
Oh yeah, it's like I said, these things are awesome. They're horribly brutal, nasty creatures, and that what makes them cool. So yeah, as I read up on these things and the stuff that they do, it's just they caught me as just being so charismatically different and horror show that I wanted to have them. They're definitely not for everybody. If you like to hold your animals, these are not the animals for you. They are very foul-tempered. The wildcaughts are definitely more so, but even the captive bred ones, like my babies, straight out of the egg, will just curl up and do that S curve and show their belly and open their mouths and gape at you. They are ballsy. They, again, straight out of the egg, they will bite you. And, they don't care. They know that they can inflict a wound, and so they defend themselves absolutely. And you wouldn't think that a snake whose head was the size of your pinky, the tip of your pinky, would be able to do as much damage as they do, but those teeth that they have are exceedingly sharp, and they know how to use them. And I know that from experience because I've been hit a couple of times, and you bleed a lot. There's no real science studies in it, but I'm almost positive that they have an anticoagulant in their saliva, because you get hit and you don't stop bleeding for an hour or more.
And that's why
my first experience. Yeah, right. My first experience with them was, I want to say 2010 at an NARBC show. I think the guy who brought him in, he goes by like Samurai Reptiles or something. He usually brings in Coronata, the horn frogs from Japan. Mm-hmm. And he had a group of babies on his table. And I was interested in them, and they're, I think from Japan, those animals, they're just typically brown, if memory serves me correct. I forgot what island they come from, but I remember going to sex them, and I got nailed more on those things than any other colubrid I've ever handled before. And there is something in their saliva, and I say that because I do have allergies, because I lost feeling in 2 of my fingers on my hand. So either it hit a nerve or there's something else with those animals.
Neat.
Yeah, I haven't had any numbness factor. I've heard some people say that, again, there hasn't been a lot of real work done with them in the scientific field. I've heard some people say they do have a Duverois. I've heard other people say they don't. I guess I bleed like a stuck pig, but I never got any numbness or anything behind them. But it wouldn't surprise me. I mean, almost all of these epistoglyphs have got something.
Yeah. So now that we've gone over why you love them, let's talk about keeping. So when you brought those animals home from Outback, what was your strategy with? I'm assuming they went into a quarantine period.
Yes.
What did you do?
They went into quarantine. So I treated them externally. Again, I did that, a little bit of frontline on some gloves, not a lot. Just gave them a once over, which, is real fun because they get a hold of you. They strip right through that glove into your hand. And let me tell you, frontline stings like a bitch in an open wound. I set them up in tubs at just ambient room temperature. So in my quarantine room probably runs about mid 70s or so. And the species that we see the most in the hobby is Oligodon purpurescens. So these come from, Thailand area, Malaysia area. And while a lot of people hear that and think, okay, so these guys like it hot, they do not like it hot. They're very crepuscular. They're very fossorial. They dig and they burrow and they like to be underground and hidden a lot. So they actually prefer to be in that, mid 70s to mid 80s region. It gets hotter than that and they get very, very temperamental and don't like it. And they go downhill fast. They also don't like to be too dry. So with most quarantine animals, I will set them up on like a paper towel or something. With these, knowing that they liked to dig, it probably wouldn't be secure on just a paper towel. I went with a very thin layer of just that, loose cocoa peat, cocoa earth. And I kept it damp, not sodden. And then just out of an abundance of caution, I threw a layer of leaf litter in, again, because I wanted them to feel secure to be able to establish in. Keeping them like that makes it difficult to do things like fecals and stuff. So I just kind of monitored the animals to see how they looked and what they were doing. One of mine did develop sort of cyst-looking things on the outside of her body, which I took to be some type of, nematode or worm type of infection. And then another one I noticed when I was checking her over, just in one of my check the animal over every couple of weeks. I noticed what looked like a threadworm or something in behind her spectacle.
Yeah.
So at that point, I did a worm treatment. I know the go-to for that is, what's the stuff? It's the one that I never used because I used ivermectin. Ivermectin is a much heavier hitter, but it's got a more broad effect. Panicure, that's what I'm thinking. I did not use Panicure. Panicure tends to be the go-to. It tends to be a little bit more tolerated by most animals. It probably would have worked, but I had ivermectin on hand. I also know how to dose it. But again, ivermectin is exceedingly toxic if you screw up. I don't recommend it for just anybody to use. Like, you have to dilute it almost 1 part in 1,000.
Yeah, and in Travis's day job, listeners, he's diluting things all the time. He's a molecular biologist.
Yeah,
so
in my day,
do not go out and get
job,
ivermectin.
I'm used to working with pipettes and things. So doing 1 to 1,000, 1 to 10,000 dilutions it's common for me, and I have the ability to, make those dilutions just second naturedly. But even then, I double checked with my veterinarian to make sure that, my math was right, my dosage was right, and everything before I did this, because I know how toxic ivermectin can be. And I went on even the light side of the dosage recommended, just because I did not want to overdo it. My adults, as I was, all these wild-caught adults that I was establishing, they all immediately were taking quail eggs, just lop the top off the quail egg and put it in. They come over, they suck it right out. That made it very easy for me, because after I made the ivermectin dilution, I took a tuberculin syringe or a diabetic syringe, and I just injected the volume of ivermectin into there. And then I gave them that, and they ate it that way. Oh, cool. So I didn't have to fight them. I didn't have to pry their mouth open and tube dose them. It was just a very easy way to get it into them. With all of the animals, the one with the little cysts on her body, those cleared out. The one that I saw the little threadworm behind her eye, that cleared out, and they established down fine. I know that people generally say quarantine should be like 3 months. I think 3 months for wild-caught animals is very short. My typical quarantine for a wild-caught animal is at least 6 months. I have gone up to 14. Just because it's not just a matter of they look healthy. It's that they look healthy. They have established eating regularly. They're stable. They're shedding fine. I want to make sure that when I do move the animal finally into my actual room, it's not going to be so traumatic that it throws the animal completely back off. The Kukris, I had all of them in quarantine for 8.5 months before I moved them. And again, that was for, them to be shedding regularly and cleanly looking, their fecal matter just to be looking more normal, and not, every once in a while I would find a fecal and it would look just kind of off or something. I waited until they just started looking basically like how, my Alterna would look when I would see them in the cage. They were more comfortable. They had calmed down. They, while still flighty, weren't, freaking out and bashing against the back of the tub trying to get away from me every time I opened it. At that point, I moved them into 2x2 cages.
Okay.
They, again, like I said, very crepuscular and fossorial, so they have a nice deeper litter of equal parts leaf litter, mulch, hydrated wood pellets, which basically just turn into like a sawdust, and that loose cocoa earth. That stays really light and lofty, and then I add about 30% milled sphagnum moss.
Okay.
That helps retain moisture. Put that in, and then again, just huge layer of leaf litter so that they can, hide under that. And then I throw in a bunch of places for them to hide. Cork flats, cork rounds. I have like some of those hanging finch nests. I take those and I just throw them in there because they're just little good bundly ball areas for them to hide in. And then I planted in a bunch of low-lying plants. So wandering Jew, English ivy, stuff like that. It grows low, it vines around, it can stand being beaten up a little bit and dug up and not get really damaged. And, I basically put them in there, and for the most part, I don't see them very much. But, that's normal because their main activity time is, once the lights go out and stuff. every once in a while they'll make an appearance, or I'll look in and I'll see just a head sticking out of one of those finch nests or something. Or if there's a cork round, I can see a head that peeks out from the cork round. But they tend to hide out most during the day. They get very active at night or the evening.
So it's definitely a naturalistic strategy for you.
That's how I go with them. In fact, that's how I do most of my stuff. Like, pretty much only my ball pythons exist in a tub system. But the kukri thrive under these naturalistic looking ones. I do know some people who just keep them in tubs. They tend to use cypress mulch because it holds humidity, gives them something to dig in, doesn't get like too wet and boggy and swampy, which the really fine cocoa earth can do. But in a cage, the cocoa earth stuff works really well.
Travis, off of that too, with your keeping style, are you keeping them in communities?
I'm not. The only time I put them together is if I'm pairing them. They don't seem to do well when paired together on a more long-term basis, at least from everything that I have read on them. Male-male combat is exceedingly frequent, but male-female combat is also common. They seem to be kind of territorial.
Interesting.
So they have their established space, and they will fight to maintain their established space. So I generally keep them as solos. And when I pair them in a neutral space. I take both animals out of their cages and put them in a pairing box, basically. And I watch them to make sure they don't start mauling each other, because if that happens, you want to break them apart. They like to bite and attack more the tail end. In fact, you will see a lot of these wild caughts when they come in, their tails are mangled. And that's from combating each other. They bite, and they bite to damage. The females, their tails are more jacked up usually, because the males try to get away to prevent that because of how, the hemipenes are tucked away in the tails. They know that if they fight too long, they're going to risk having their hemipenes damaged. So they try to escape and get away from that. But one of my females that I got, who's wild caught, her tail is just mangled. It looks like it's been through a garbage disposal.
So as far as heating is concerned, you said that you were keeping things ambient. Do you have like an LED light on them? Any lights on them? I
have an LED light. Yeah.
What kind of lighting?
It's just, it's not even a really high intensity one, again, because they're, a more crepuscular fossorial species. So it's just like a flat aquarium LED. Mm-hmm. It's about 12 inches. And I've just got it hooked up in the top. I have it on a 12 and 12 because that goes with their natural light cycle. And, my room, my full snake room, it gets a bit of a seasonal flux because it's down in the basement. So in the summer, it probably gets up to mid 80s. In the winter, it drops down to, low to mid 70s.
Gotcha. So
Travis, one thing I would like to talk about a little bit on this is related to feeding. And I say that purely because, from some of the people that I've chatted with on these animals, now that they're on their second, third generation of animals, they've noticed that sometimes the animals will be doing great and then just go, in terms of snap. And the reason why I ask about the feeding behavior, the type of prey you're offering your specific animals, whether it's just specifically eggs or if you're mixing in some protein, but I'm more curious about your thoughts on microflora and whether or not you think there might be missing too as well with these captive animals.
I think the rapid decline that we're seeing in a lot of the captive bred stuff is two reasons. One, I think part of it may be a little bit of inbreeding depression, because again, all these captive breds that we're seeing second, third, fourth generation are the Tioman Island ones. And like I said, Tioman closed down. So we're dealing with a bit of a limited gene pool there. The red animals that I produced last year, I did an outcross. I bred a Tioman male to a wild-caught female, and incidentally proved that the red trait is a dominant trait because all the babies hatched out red. So if you see anybody saying that they have clean blood or new blood Tiomans, they're lying. Like I said, Tioman is closed down. I think that's part of the reason. And that's why I outcrossed. But I also think that a large part of the reason goes back to, again, like Zach's comment about that king. These animals are not being fed properly in the hobby. They're just being massively pumped full of fatty rodents, and that's not what they're used to eating. That's not what they evolved to eat. So we're seeing an obesity problem, and that's causing them to die off. I'm in a Kukri group on Facebook, and some of the animals I see are it hurts my soul. Like I'm sure you both you've seen those animals that have like the fat frog double, triple, quadruple chin thing going on. It's horrible. I don't push my animals to grow fast. I have babies that are almost a year old and they're nowhere near adult size. There are guys in that group that are posting animals that are a year old and ready to breed. Females, so they're almost 18 inches, 2 feet. It's so wrong to me. So I think that is part of the problem too, is they're just being pounded and power fed and overdone. I also think maybe people are keeping them too hot, and that's just, like I said, that causes a quick decline. I noticed pretty fast when where I had my snakes originally, when I positioned the cages, they were actually sitting on top of another cage, and the heat from the other cage was overheating the cages, and all of mine were just pushed up against the glass. It was the only time I actually saw them out in the day because they didn't like it. And at that point, I moved their cages to keep them in a cooler area. Microfauna, that may help just as like an intestinal gut thing, but I think the biggest thing is properly feeding them. And that goes back to what I said earlier about what they're designed to do and how they're designed to eat. Eggs seem to make up a very large part of their diet. I would also argue that they're probably eating arthropods, insects. I wouldn't be surprised if they ate slugs and snails. I haven't tried feeding those, but now that I mentioned it, I might go out and buy a can of snails and give it a whirl, because why not? And I bet those teeth would be good at getting through the snail shells. But I will also, knowing that they'll eat bird eggs or reptile eggs, they're not just coming across, an egg that's infertile. They're going to come across eggs that are various stages of fertility and development. So what I will do with mine is I have got the Reptilinks microlinks. And when I cap a quail egg, I'll take one of those little microlinks, which is only about 1 centimeter long, and I'll stick it in the egg. And I generally, with those, I use like the quail or the frog or the iguana microlinks. So I'm going with something that isn't really fatty, but still gives, the bone and the actual meat and protein and stuff. And I only do that about once every 3rd or 4th feeding. Because I don't want to overload them with, protein or things like that. Randomly, I will feed them a baby quail. Every once in a while, I might do a mouse pink or something if I have an extra leftover from feeding. And, it's like I fed everybody, but I still have pinks that I haven't gone through. But I'm not feeding them hoppers, fuzzies, rat pinks, things like that, because it just, they're not designed for that. They're not designed to take that.
So what's your frequency of feeding? So
I feed I don't feed very frequently for them. I feed every couple of weeks, usually, which is it kind of goes against the whole colubrids eat smaller things more frequently, and I probably could do smaller, but a quail egg is a substantial meal for these guys, and that's why I space it out. If I were doing like maybe half of a microlink, I might go every 3 or 4 days because I'm sure they would burn through that really easily. But a quail egg with a link is more than enough to give them a couple of weeks. And I also seasonally feed, so I feed pretty consistently in spring and summer. Then I taper off in the fall. In the winter, I'm only feeding like maybe once a month, maybe once every 6 weeks. Because again, I try to go as much as I can towards how the natural cycle of things would be for them. And, things don't breed all year, every year.
Yeah.
So you're not always going to find eggs that you can get a hold of, or small enough lizards that you can get a hold of, or baby birds that you can get a hold of. Turtle eggs. There's a fascinating study done on another population of these on an island. They basically hang out on the beach when the turtles come in.
Mm-hmm.
And as soon as the turtle finishes, and sometimes even before burying their nest, the females are going in, and they stay in the nest until they basically consume everything that they can. But that's the only time they eat all year, is during turtle nesting season.
That's crazy. That's boom bust feeding in its purest form.
Yes.
Yeah. So you're keeping them in 2x2s, LED lighting. Substrate seems to be super important with your keeping strategy. And then we're feeding the animal up single. We're not keeping them together because they beat the hell out of each other.
Yeah.
And then feeding, I don't want to say sparingly, I would think, but bi-weekly with the quail eggs, and then putting the microlink in there, but we're avoiding rodents if we can. Is that fair? All right.
Yes.
So with that keeping
rodents
strategy,
are a very, very infrequent thing.
With that keeping strategy, then that led to you having captive reproduction, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So let's talk about that. So it sounds like you kind of did a food cycling strategy versus a thermal cycling strategy to get the eggs. Is that fair?
The room, I mean, it's kind of everything.
Kind of everything.
My room just goes through a natural cycle in and of itself. Mm-hmm. So I just let that be the natural cooling cycle. It's not really a huge change. I also do a moisture cycle.
Oh, cool.
Because basically, going with that area, they don't get a huge temperature difference, but they do see sort of a monsoon and less monsoon. I'm not going to say they have a full-on dry season, but they have a wet season and they have a wetter season, as it were. So during the wetter season, I'm misting the cages a couple of days a week, only for about 30 seconds or a minute. But during the less wet season, I'm hitting it for about a minute every 7 to 10 days.
Gotcha.
So I cycle, they're getting all these things together as a cycle. And then just looking at, papers and captive keeping from the guys in Europe, and also just ecology and when things are turning up there. I started pairing in December, January, which is kind of about the mid of their less wet season, but it times out really well to be the eggs would be hatching during the midst of the actual wet season, which is when you would think that things would start to be, booming and breeding, especially amphibians and reptiles and stuff. So that's when I started pairing. They lock for a long time, really long time. I had them locked for, I want to say like 50 odd hours.
Holy.
Once. And as long as they were locked together, I just left them be in that little box together. As soon as I saw that they were apart, and they do go to the opposite ends of that little box, I put them back in the cages. I only paired them 3 times, once in December, once in January, once in February. And I just kind of left them to their own devices. After that, I didn't really notice any change in behavior in the female, which isn't surprising, like I said, given how secretive and hidey-hidey they are. But, when I went in, I still go in and I check them by lifting the flats and the hides and stuff. And I checked her, and I noticed that she was constantly underneath this one hide and sort of coiling and spinning to clear an area out, which in hindsight was a pretty good clue for me. And then one week I came down and I lifted it up to check on her, and I had a nice little stack of 7 eggs. So pulled them out, just set them up in an incubation box, left them at, room temperature. Again, just basically the box went right on top of her cage. And then almost a month to the day later, I was checking up on her and found a second clutch.
Interesting.
Which surprised me because nowhere had I read from anybody that they double clutched. But apparently they do.
How many eggs were in that clutch?
8. 8.
Cool. And then at room temperature, how long till you have babies on the ground?
It took, so for the first ones, since those ones hit at about Marchish, those ones took about 100 days. I think it was 101 days for them to hatch. But again, March, April, it's still kind of cool in my room. So not a surprise that it took them a little longer. The second clutch, which came in April, and the room started heating up a little bit more, they went in 87 days.
Oh, gotcha.
I have heard of people incubating them at higher temps, 82 or so, and getting them to hatch in 50, 60 days. But I don't really feel the need to, again, I figure keeping the eggs at around the same temperature as the adults, which they seem to be pretty happy with, is the better way to do it. Fair.
So now,
one thing we really haven't brought up in any prior episodes, Zach, but I'm kind of curious too. In terms of fertility for second clutches, are you seeing 100% fertile eggs? Are you seeing some differences in terms of ratio? Or
I had 100% fertility, and I didn't see any real difference in sex ratios on them. Let's see, the first one I had 3.4, and the second clutch I had 4.4.
Yeah, it's something I'm always curious about, because especially with retained sperm, there's been published studies related to feeding behavior and feeding animals well during that aspect to produce a second clutch. But it's something a lot of people don't really mention in terms of fertility of the number of eggs, especially here where you have an egg-eating species. You would think that even you would have some infertility there too as well, just to promote animals after hatching to provide a natural food source right out of the egg.
That's interesting.
Yeah, that would be a logical type of thing, I would guess. But yeah, again, at the same time, if they're hatching, when you've got a bunch of amphibians or something breeding, then they can immediately go out and start preying on amphibian eggs, which should be really abundant. It's an interesting idea, and I hadn't thought of it, though.
Yeah. And we will definitely have much like the Brumation Bonanza episode, we're going to have a reproduction episode. We just got way too busy. Because I went down a massive rabbit hole with double clutching. And is this normal? Is this okay? What's going on? How does it happen? Where is the sperm stored? because I had to do that when I was working with the book. Because it turns out with these South American snakes that I work with, you could probably go so far as to say that it is totally the norm and probably a, dare I say it, beneficial thing. But I don't think it's the norm for all colubrid and colubroids. It does make sense where these guys live and the predation pressures that they're experiencing, that if a female ends up finding good real estate and she's had multiple copulations, that she produced those eggs just due to the fact that there's a lot of things in that part of Asia where they live that are eating snakes. And that's kind of the evolutionary strategy with the South American guys is the exact same. It's a direct response to predation pressure with neonates. But that's a conversation for another day. So now you have 15 baby kukris?
Yeah.
Little bloodletting monsters. So
little bloodletting monsters.
So how did you get them up and going? Were there any problems?
So not terribly. They all went into tubs. Just did the little 6 quarts. I put them on lightly damped sphagnum moss. Again, tossed in leaf litter for them to be able to hide under. And like a small cork flat or something to be able to hide under. Room temperature. And I waited until they had their first shed. And then I took quail egg. I beat it up. And I just used little cups, like little dipping cups. And I put like 2 to 3 mils of egg in there. And, I've got a bird crop feeding syringe. I use that to just suck up the egg. And they're really nice. They've got a dial on them so you can twist it to how much you want to dose out. So I just, 2 mils, dose, 2 mils, dose, 2 mils, dose. Put those little cups in. That worked for about half of them. They would find it and eat it and take it right away. The other half seemed to have difficulty realizing that this was food to eat. So after a couple of failed attempts that way, I took those ones, put them in one of those little deli cups that, we commonly just transport snakes to and from shows and stuff in. Put them in one of those, again, with just a little layer of sphagnum moss, put the cup in there with them, and that smaller volume, I think, just made them realize that, oh, hey, there's food here, versus the much larger volume of the 6-quart tub, because, these things hatch out only about 4 or 5 inches long, so that 6-quart tub is pretty large for them, and I just think that they probably weren't finding the food cup, so once they realized that it was there in the small deli cup, they would take it down, consume it, be happy, go back into the tub. After a couple times doing that, then I could just put it in the tub and they would seek it out.
Sweet. So that sounds really easy. I don't know what.
Yeah.
You're not dealing with rodents and pinkies and things that are too big that fit in small heads and all that.
Yep. Nope. None of that. And then after about 6 months or so, I would take one of those little microlinks. I would cut it in half because, again, really teeny tiny snakes that we're dealing with. And I would drop that in the cup as well. Some of them would take it, some of them wouldn't. And then at about a year, they have gotten large enough that I'll take a quail egg and cap it and put that in there. They won't eat the whole volume of it, but it's not so much that they're intimidated by the full volume of the egg.
And now we have captive bred kukris, thanks to Travis.
Mm-hmm. And should have more in another couple of months.
There we go.
But they'll be the brown ones. So if you really want the red ones, too bad. You're going to have to wait another couple of years.
Mm-hmm.
That's why you can order your Kevlar gloves ahead of time.
Exactly.
Yeah, you say that, but I got a pair of those, like cut-proof, stick-proof gloves. Son of a bitch went right through it.
Really?
Right through it.
Interesting.
It was one of the adults, but still, right through it.
So do we have any final things you want to tell people about Kukris that are at this point thinking, all right, this might definitely be something I'm interested in?
I mean, just be ready for a snake that does not like you at all. It doesn't want to be handled. So if you're looking for something like that, don't get these and expect to be able to do that. I will caution that a lot of the ones you're going to be seeing are coming from people who may be pushing them on rodent diets. So be prepared that you may have to change the diet of your snake for it to be more healthy. And don't keep them crazy hot. I mean, yes, they're a tropical species, but they don't like being really hot. But they're fun.
They sound like a blast.
If you like weird little things, go for it.
I think the final thing before we move on to the beak snakes that I want to talk, because I remember listening to you on one of the previous podcasts you're on. Maybe it was THP. I don't know which one it was, but you were talking about the process you went through in gathering information, and before you pulled the trigger and said yeah, and then after you pulled the trigger, and I think that process, it was kind of like preaching to the choir with me, because that's the process a very similar process to what I do. But I know that one of the things you did is you just did this epic Google Scholar journal article search. And I'm not saying you have to do that per se, but one of the things that I like about, what we just got done is part of the reason why you weren't walking through the show, saw a Kukri snake and just bought it. You did your homework. You learned about these crazy behaviors they do, these ecological, evolutionary adaptations that they have to basically be I think they're like the perfect definition of an oddball colubrid. And that kind of led to you appreciating them more, to the point where it's apparent you like the brown ones just as much as you like the red ones. Yeah. So there's an element there that when you do that kind of nerdy deep dive, it just makes keeping these things so much cooler, especially when you just explain to everyone listening that you give them substrate, put 3 inches of leaf litter there, and barely see them. But yes, they're in the box.
It's right.
So that leads to just a much more rewarding, that's the word I'm looking for, keeping experience when you know the whole picture of this animal's biology.
Yeah, it's one of the, it's very generalized to say this, but there tend to be two sides to this hobby. There's the paint job side, which like the animals for the morphs and the paint jobs and how they look and what they look like. And I'm not trashing on those people because, again, I'm a ball python person to some extent as well. I do that as well. And I get it and I understand it. Although, like I said, I'm kind of moving away from it because just the oddball thing is getting to me more and more. Then there's I keep these animals not because of what they look like, but because of just what they are. They're these unique animals that have, these strange behaviors, these oddball behaviors. And while it was initially the paint job that caught my eye with the Tiomans, it was more after I went into that deep dive on them. And yeah, I went crazy deep dive, not necessarily what everybody has to do, but you should research some into it before you go just picking up things on a whim, especially things that you've never seen before. That I really, really started to appreciate what they were. And that's why when, Outback called me and said, hey, we got some Kukris in, they're the mainland ones, they're brown, they're not like those red ones. I was like, I don't really care. They're cool animals as they are. And yeah, I really like my browns. You wouldn't think that a brown snake would be this awesome, fascinating thing, but they really kind of are. And they're fantastic in their own right because of their behaviors and their actions and their attitudes and just how they live. And that's my appreciation with, the other half of my collection. It's not so much about paint jobs. It's about the way they behave and how they act and what they do.
And that is a perfect way to transition into Ramphiophis, the beak snakes, because if you like crazy behaviors, the Lamprophiidae is the family they belong to. Holy mother of God, did they do some weird things?
Oh God, did they do weird things?
Before we get into the keeping of them, I am going to get on my nerdy taxonomy soapbox here. So these guys that we're moving on to now are firmly in the Colubroid camp. A lot of people do not realize that when we talk about beak snakes, they're part of this primarily African family of snakes that's just been recognized in the past 20 years as their own thing. They're wonderfully weird. Some close relatives to the beak snakes. So, a lot of people think that the Leoheterodon, the Madagascar hognose snakes, are just a bigger, badder version of a hognose snake. They are not even remotely related to hognose snakes, but they are related to the beak snakes. So they're Lamprophiids. The Malagasy cat-eyed snakes, which are like Boiga-esque, but not, because Boiga, the Asiatic genus, that's a Colubrid, typical Colubrid, but the Madagascarophis, those guys are Lamprophiids. And then the beak snakes, which are wonderfully fantastic. They're closely related to a snake that I've seen people think is a false water cobra called a false cobra. No, you don't want to get bit by one of those. Not that you want to get bit by a false water cobra, but if you get bit by the Egyptian false cobra, it is very painful and can be medically significant. So, but moving on.
And yet I found myself going down a rabbit hole looking at them the other day and thinking, I want these.
Yeah, no, but these guys do all kinds of crazy behaviors when it comes to basically, for lack of a better word, scent marking, and they rub, various objects. And we have, I have some experience with beak snakes. Matt has some experience with beak snakes, but Travis went down a rabbit hole with these guys, just like the Kukris. So I'm going to ask the same question. Well, first of all, you introduce Ramphiophis to the audience, and then talk a little bit about why beak snakes. You can keep all these snakes. What about them caught your fancy?
Okay, well, this is where people get to point fingers at me and be like, but you said don't do that. Yeah. These were absolutely an impulse buy. Okay. But in my defense, when I saw them and thought, hey, these are cool, the first thing I did was grab my phone and start Googling them right there in the show. And again, not a ton out there about them, but there was enough out there that, very charismatic, very active snakes, very intelligent, although sometimes their behaviors will make you question that. And again, they piqued me as being, kind of I grew up out west, and out there we have the Western coach whips. This just spoke to me as being very much like a Western coach whip. But coach whips are notorious for not doing well in captivity. They beat the hell out of themselves in cages and stuff because, again, that smarts and that level of activity, and at least with what I had read up on these in that, that little bit of time, was they don't do that. So to me, part of that appeal was, hey, this could be a chance to keep something kind of like a coach whip that isn't going to suffer by being kept in captivity. And so I brought them in and kept, reading up on them and stuff while I was getting them through their quarantine, which was not nearly as intense with them having been captive hatched babies.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they were easy to get rolling and not have to be crazily treated and pumped around and stuff. But yeah, their behaviors is, you know, again, they very much live up to that intelligent behavior. You open the tub, and if they are hiding, they pop up and they look and they come to see you. And they are happy to bask out in the open. They really like to do that. The scent marking territories, the self-rubbing behavior, which everybody's like, I don't get it. I don't understand it. And the more you read about them and the rest of the families that are associated with them, I mean, part of me is half inclined to think that it may be a bit of an environmental pressure, because the activity that I have seen the most when they do that is during the high points of summer, when it's hotter, is when they're self-rubbing more. I think that part of this rubbing behavior is to further seal in on their scales something that helps protect them from dehydration. Mm-hmm. Which is interesting because they do really bad with too much moisture. They actually will develop blisters from moisture like that if kept anything close to too wet. So it's a very bizarre behavior, but they're super charismatic. They're very smart. They've got those giant eyeballs that are always looking at you.
Excellent.
And they will eat anything. And they will not be hesitant about it. Like, if you open the cage and they think there's a possibility that you might have food, they will come at you. And when I say come at you, it's not like a timid, hey, what do you have? It's a, oh, hey, food monkey. And they will come. And this is where I say they seem very smart, but sometimes they're very stupid. I have had one just torpedo straight out of the cage. And if you're not fast enough to catch a speeding missile out of the cage, it will bounce off of the floor, and then good luck trying to catch this little speed demon off of the floor.
So, Travis, having played around with these guys, what's your thought on keeping them, whether it be, you know, neonates, juveniles, adults? Do you keep them differently? Do you keep them in groups? What's your general practice in terms of keeping?
So I started with the neos that I picked up, kept them in tubs, again, just as an establishment factor. But once they were large enough, they went into a 2x2 together. And then they are now up to a 4x4. Sorry. Yeah. 4x3. Sorry. And that's my oxys. I have a single Rastratus. It's a probable male. I'm hoping to pick up a female later this year.
Let's talk about that real quick, actually, because sexing these guys is not normal. We're not getting the probes out.
Yeah, actually, that is a very important thing. In fact, I've had to counsel a couple of people on that recently. These species, most of the families that are, you know, the Samoyeds family, they do not pop normally. In fact, if you try to pop them, more than likely you're going to snap their spine and lead to kinking. So if you find somebody who says they've sexed it by popping it, just turn around and walk away, because you're probably going to be buying a damaged animal. Probes. The hemipenes on males are tiny, 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 tiny. If somebody has probed a male, congratulations, they have just sterilized that male. Mm-hmm. So there's your two main ways of sexing snakes that go straight out the window. The next one people say, especially with colubrids, is tail length. That really doesn't work with these, because about a quarter to a third of the tails on these things is tail length, or body length is tail length. So you can't really say the one with the longer tail No. These all have just insanely long tails from the vent to the tip. That leaves you with sheds. You can look at the shed for the hemipene shed. Again, super tiny, very hair-like. You can also take your shed and send it to Ben Morrill, and while his test is not 100%, it's sometimes pretty accurate and works. I sent him the sheds from my original pair, 3 different sheds, and he tested all of them at the same time, and he said, I think you have a pair, because one set of those sheds consistently hit with being male, but it was a very weak male signal. It turns out he was right when I ended up getting eggs this past season. I did not take it as an absolute, but I did take it as a Ben says there's a chance, so I'm hoping that this is accurate. The Rastratus that I picked up, again, the woman I picked him up from, based on the shed and just seeing the little teeny tiny hair-like, she felt that he was male, but we also sent a shed into Ben, and again, he said, I see a band, but it's not a really good clean one, so those two things together make me say it's probably a male, but until I actually have a female to go with it and I actually produce from it, nobody can say for sure.
So I'm glad we covered that, because this is not an easy group of snakes to sex. That's why a lot of times people do the beaks.
It's not. And like I said, I have had people contacting me recently, hearing me talk about them, thinking that they sound cool. And they're like, I'm at a show and this guy's got 1.1. And I was like, how did he sex them? Oh, he popped them. I was like, just walk away right now. Oh, he probed him.
Even worse.
That's it. That is a sterilized male right there. You're not going to get anything from it. Just walk away.
Yeah, even from my time of keeping these animals, they do seem to do fairly well in groups, which also lends me to think that you may also have subdominant males too as well in this communal structure, similar to, from my experience from keeping Ackies too as well. When you're raising them as a group, you may create this community structure within the animals too as well.
Yeah. And I feel they're kind of, there's no real good correlation between them to anything that's like super common in the hobby. Like I said, they're very coach whippy in behavior, but I think they're very almost garter snake in that sort of kind of communal mentality, or water snake. I do think they do better in pairs or small groups, because I think they do have a little bit of social nature to them, which, a lot of people think is very uncommon with snakes, but more and more as we start to see the ecology and study of these animals, we're finding that there is a lot of social structure to snakes.
100% on that one.
And again, in my readings while I was raising them up, that's why once I was ready to graduate them out of tubs, I put them together in a cage, because everything that I had read indicated that it's very common to find pairs and groups of these animals. And mine almost always are, they're in the same place, and there are so many places for them to hide, and the gradients are great for them everywhere. They could very easily both be in separate hides and still be getting the right gradient that they want, but they both are curled up together.
So in terms of feeding both neonates as well as juveniles and adults, did the neonates start off on pinks right away without any effort?
The neonates that I picked up started off on pinks right away. The ones that I just hatched, I have had a lot of difficulty with. 2 took right away, 3 did not. Those 3 all declined. I lost them. I tried everything with them. I tried pinks. I tried gecko tails. I tried scenting pinks. I tried washing pinks. I tried braiding pinks. I tried boiling pinks. I tried just tails. So for some reason, these ones were just very stubborn. But the ones that, the initial ones that I brought in, they took right to pinks. Again, I think that this is another species, given where they come from and how active and just site-oriented they are. I would not be in the least bit surprised to find out that they start out on arthropods, spiders, small insects and things. So I would not necessarily be averse to the idea of trying like crickets. I didn't actually go out and deal with that, or even cockroaches. They do dig and burrow some, so I would not be surprised to find out if they're eating little toads and things too.
So the thermal environment for them.
Yes.
Let's talk a little bit about that.
They like it. They like to be warm, but they also like to have cold spots. So my hot spot gets to 110 degrees, and they will openly bask underneath that, and they will sit there for an hour or more. My cold side is probably about 80-ish or so, and they will hang out there. They will go back and forth during the day. They also very much seem to appreciate UV.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't just mean that, they look better, they act better. I do my UV on random timers. So it comes on randomly between the hours of 11 a.m. and 5 p.m. But on any given day, you don't know when it will be on and when it will be off. They come out as soon as that thing turns on. And they hang out underneath it until it turns off, and then they go away. And then when it turns back on again randomly, they come back out and they go hang out underneath it. So they can sense the UV, and two, they actively seek it out.
That makes total sense.
I also, it does.
Based off their ecology.
Yes, it does. And I have said in a lot of groups and in a couple of podcasts that there's a part of me that thinks that snakes don't directly UV seek for the sake of UV. I think they UV seek because they've interpreted that giant flaming ball of warmth in the sky is also putting out UV. So when they're cold and they're looking to thermoregulate, they find the highest UV signature, knowing that that's where also the most direct heat is going to come from. But these snakes, they will, they'll hang out under the heat when the UV is off if they want the heat. But as soon as the UV comes on, they will reposition themselves to be more under the UV, which I've got my UV and my heat in proximal areas to each other, but they will reposition themselves to get more under the UV than just the heat. So I do think they actively seek UV because it benefits them separately from just the heat factor.
Well, it also makes total sense if you're a active pursuit diurnal predator that you be queuing in on the cue that lets you know, okay, we're at maximum UVB radiation. We're probably at maximum UVA radiation, which means our body temp is going to be where it needs to be physiologically for us to go out on a foraging foray that might last a couple hours. You don't want to. There's a whole lot of cues that have to go that are probably part of that decision-making process in the wild that they're going to be denied in a plastic box, whether we like it or not. I've always thought that Ramphiophis is one of the main snake genera that could be used to further support this idea of let's just give them some UVB. It's not going to hurt them. It may actually help them. And then, behaviorally, it seems to be doing that. We've seen the exact same thing with the Rufus. Is that right? The beaks that we're keeping at West Liberty. When the UVB comes on, they're just bam, right on it.
right there to it.
The Matt gave me a bunch last fall, and we didn't have anywhere to. We didn't have a. We don't quarantine things in tanks. We quarantine them in racks. In the quarantine, when they were in the racks, they were getting the body temperature, and it was totally what you talked about. You open the tub, and there's this little beaked snake rocketing towards the opening. Once they figured out that tub opens, Fuzzy shows up. That got pretty damn exciting. I took on those. I did not want the students working with them because we're about to hit on Venom here in a second. But one of my colleagues, Kinsey Guthrie, she keeps one that I will just say forcibly acquired at a reptile show, and that's a story in and unto itself. As a neonate, fresh hatchling, and she raised it up, and in her office she gives it UVB, and she mentions the exact same thing. UVB light comes on, boom, snake's like immediately under it. UVB light goes off, it's going about, its day. And the animals that Matt gave me, they're in a big exo in my office now, and they have a UVB light. Exact same observation. And I move the UVB light and they follow it. So that's two people now saying that when the UVB comes on, they're out there. So pretty cool animal. So I'm assuming then it is safe to say, once again, naturalistic keeping strategy.
Yes.
Cool.
And with these ones, I use a very similar base mix to the Kukris, except I leave out the sphagnum moss and the leaf litter. And I add in a bit of sand. It retains just enough moisture when I spray it that, it slowly lets it out over the interim, but it does not become wet and boggy all the time. Because like I said, too much moisture on these guys is it's very, 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 very bad. Lots of nooks and crannies for them to hide in. They like to cram into little tight spaces, but also lots of areas for them to climb out and bask on because they love to just sprawl out on top of things. Branches, twigs, things like that.
Cool. So you mentioned that you bred them. How'd that go down? And
that was there was no intention there. I mean, I had hoped that it was legitimately a pair, and I wanted to be able to breed them because they really are cool little animals. But I just went in and, checking on them, I flipped one of the hides and found the female around 5 eggs. And so, boom, now I definitely know that I have a sex pair. But I can't tell you anything special about what I did with them other than I just kept them the way I keep them. They are now about 6 years old. So it took them this long to get up to maturity. They have been together for 5.5 years. So it's not like they brushed into it or anything. This is how long it took them to just legitimately get to their comfortable breeding size and behavior for them to do it.
It's interesting.
Again, they get
that you got eggs with the group setting, because that people were working with Leoheterodon forever, the Malagasy hognose snakes, and people started having success when they just kept them in trios with a male and 2 females, or a reverse trio. But with like the whole introducing and introduction and the kind of classic Colubrid keeping strategy didn't necessarily, it let people bred them. But once this group setting started taking off, got eggs. And so it's kind of interesting that you did the group setting and got eggs with another Lamprephian.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that goes back to, like I said, I think these animals just do naturally better in a little bit more socialized type of keeping. But again, I can't give you any specifics as to when things happened or how things happened. It just, I know that they like to hang out together. So obviously 1 or 2 or 5 times during while them hanging out together, they decided to lock up, and it all worked out well.
And just a side note, I'm trying to find this paper, but talking about eyesight predators and reptilia, I feel like something was published related to the cones and rods specifically with these animals, and I want to say it was Carl Jens in the 50s, but I can't find it. But I remember them saying something related to UV radiation related to movement predators, if you will, related to the way their eye is structured.
Oh, cool.
So because they have the one scalation at the front that helps in their sight-seeking predation. And this is just from going down my rabbit hole of my past in physiology and anatomy. So
there you go. No, there's a lot to be done with this group. The only potential limiting factor, and definitely need to talk about this with them, is that they are epistoglyphous and they do have Duvernoy secretion. So with the Kukris, it's question mark. With Ramphiophis, they definitely have something going on there. So
there is no question there.
Do you want to speak to that?
I will speak to it as much as I can. Mm-hmm. So I did have a degree of hesitation when I picked them up when I read about that. But the guys at Outback had all told me, they don't tend to bite. And on the rare occasion they do, it's not that bad. Now, I take both of those with a grain of salt on the initial thing. Over the past 6 years of keeping them, I can mostly attest to the first. None of my 3 animals have ever tried to nip, bite, come at me in any way, shape, or form. So I don't feel they are prone to defensively biting. That said, I may just have animals that are, have that calm temperament, because we all know that animals are all going to have their own individual personalities. So you may get one that's just an asshole. I haven't seen any that are like that, but that doesn't mean they're not out there. I will also say again, these guys are smart. I haven't tried it, but I would bet money that you could target train these things in probably about a week. Mm-hmm. Because they're very quick to pick up on behaviors and actions. I will with mine, when it's feeding time, I knock on their cage first before I open it. So now they know if I open the cage and I haven't knocked, it's not feeding time. So I don't have to worry about the flying torpedo maneuver anymore. I mention that because if you do something to piss these animals off or harm them, I don't doubt that they will hold a grudge. And so if you're keeping them and you are not treating them well, then you may end up with that asshole snake that wants to bite you because it knows you're not a safe person. Kind of like crows. If you do something to offend a crow, it's going to remember you for the rest of its life. So, scientifically proven, no, but I strongly suspect that would be the case with them. Bite reports from them, there are not a ton of them. Most of them tend to be, not that bad. Localized swelling, pain, stuff like that. But there are 2 that are pretty nasty, necrotizing, swelling all the way up to the arm. One ended up in a hospital. I think it's a matter of how the snake bites and positioning.
Yeah.
I think most of the people who've been bitten have probably been mistaken food bites. And once they realize that it's your hand, it's just like the quick pop and grab. So what those people are getting is not a legitimate dosage of the venom. I know that studies on the venom itself show that it is an extremely potent venom. And on the very rare occasion that I have thrown live items in to feed, because these guys do seem to like hunting things down every once in a while, a mouse hopper will drop in about 12 seconds after it's been bit. So on the one hand, yeah, maybe a venom towards a domestic mouse is not the best key because domestic mice are not exactly the most immunologically robust animals, but that's still a very rapid effect.
Oh, yeah.
So they are definitely animals that need to be treated with respect. I do not handle them willy-nilly and treat them like I would my Alterna. In fact, I use a hook most of the time when I'm trying to get them out and manipulate them, which can be very difficult because they don't like to sit still and they don't like to ride a hook at all. But just for basic manipulation, just to try and move them around, a hook is very much recommended for me. I don't recommend just going straight in and trying to grab them. I think that they will have the potential there to take that as an insult or an attack and turn around and bite defensively, and it could end up badly.
I have probably the dumbest thing I've done in the past decade with a snake in human care involved one of these. It was a Rastrata, I believe. The other one.
Oxyrhynchus.
Yeah.
So let's touch on that real quick before your story.
Because that's a nightmare.
Both of them, so there are 3 species that you will see in the hobby. One is exceedingly rare. You're no longer allowed to import them legally. Those are the Reproduction. 99.9% of the time, whatever you're getting is not going to be one of those. You really have to hunt and find those. I only know 2 people with them, and they're not going to let theirs go easy. The other 2 that you see are Oxyrhynchus and Rastratus. By far, the most common is Oxyrhynchus. Now, the confusion comes, both Oxyrhynchus and Rastratus are called rufous-beaked snakes. They are different animals. The Rastratus are very much easy to tell. They have a black eyeliner stripe over their eyes. The Oxys do not. As they grow older, the Rastratus also have sort of black outlining to their scales. They do develop that kind of coach whip look to them, both in their behavior and their actual look. The Oxys tend to be more uniformly tan brown with a little bit of pinky orange overlay to them. They do not have the eye stripe. There's slight differences in head structure, but that's the main thing. And so when you hear somebody say they have a rufous-beaked snake, it could be either Oxy or Rastratus. It's most likely the Oxyrhynchus.
And that's what we have, are the Oxyrhynchus. So I was at a local show with my son about, 4 or 5 years ago. I was in a really bad mood. I went to the show to get pinkies, and it was not, I don't know. Maybe I am trashing on shows. It was your classic importer show, but not the best of importers. Let's just leave it at that. And everything was half dead.
Show.
It was everything that was wrong with herpetoculture in one space. And I really just don't like being in that environment. It makes me, I love these animals. I love reptiles and amphibians. I'm a conservation biologist. That's my day job. And I'm literally in this show just like, this is everything that's wrong with herpetoculture. And I was waiting to get the mice, and the mouse line was huge. So Colin and I are just walking around the show, and we ended up at this guy's table. And at the table, no clue who this guy is. Never seen him again. Maybe it's because of what happened. But I just looked down. I don't know if it was because Colin was there. I don't know if it was because I was in the mood. But I just looked at the guy and was like, you're going to give me those. And he looked at me like, what the hell are you talking about? Because he had these Oxyrhynchus fresh hatchlings. And kudos to him for them hatching out. But they were labeled at $300 a piece. And they also looked like they were going to die later that day. Like they were just in the roughest of rough shape. I've never done this before, never did this after. And he just kind of looked at me, and I was just like, you're just going to give me those because you know they're going to die. No one's going to pay that kind of money. At least give them a chance. And he was like, okay. And then just slowly holds the deli cup up. And I was like, wow, I just bullied my way into some beak snakes, I guess. I don't know what the hell happened. So now I've got these 2 neonatal beak snakes that are on the verge of death. And on the way home, I'm thinking, like, why did you do this? Since these things are going to die, Lord knows what viruses they are holding, given the facilities that they were in. So they went into their own room at the university. Like we have quarantine, and they went into their own room that was multiple doors away from everything. And myself and Kinsey, Mrs. Guthrie, took it upon us. We were just going to save these snakes. It's the only time I've done this. And one of them just crashed immediately and died. I mean, within like 2 weeks, it was dead. But the other one, we could assist feed it. And it was an interesting little thing because we were taking pinkies and cutting them in half laterally. And that would fit in the mouth. And it would actually go about, once we could get it into the mouth and put the snake down, run away, we were doing that one. It would then swallow the mouse, the pinky, and we, everything's good. So I was the guy that was doing the assist feeding. And it was like the 4th or 5th time that we did that. And I've got the snake. And as I was working the pinky, I couldn't get the forceps to work. So I had to use my hands. And I had read the paper you're talking. I know the exact paper you're talking about because I knew about I think it's metalloproteases or something that are in there. Mm-hmm. And as I was working the pinky in, everything was cool. And I somehow managed to have this. The snake did not want to bite me, but my finger ended up being embedded in its opistoglyphus tooth because as I was working the pinky down in there, and it's kind of doing that whole walk in the jaws over the pinky, everything's cool. My phone rang, and I got distracted, and I just ever so gently moved my right hand, and I moved it. I thought I was moving it away from its mouth. I was moving it into its mouth. This is why Zach doesn't work with Bitus or cobras or I don't trust myself. I will never work with those animals. I have kudos and mad respect. And this incident sealed it. And I ended up inadvertently getting that damn little itty bitty fang stuck on my finger. And I can attest to this fact. Immediately, I felt, and this is like an 8-inch snake. This is fresh out of the egg, not even months old. Immediately, I started feeling pins and needles. Like the sensation you have when your foot's asleep. I was feeling it in the tip of my finger. And so I got, the snake off my hand, put him down, and he proceeded to eat the pinky mouse, which I was really happy about. And I put my hand underneath some extremely hot water because I thought that might break down proteins or something. And then I just went and sat in my office. And this is the only time I've done anything of this nature. And nothing happened. But I did get some swelling. And I can say, well, actually, something did happen. It happened on my right index finger. And that last knuckle in my finger, it swelled up a little bit. And it was kind of arthritic for about a month. And that was a fresh out of the egg neonate that I somehow managed to get stuck on my finger. It wasn't the snake's fault. It was not a bite. But it was on there for about 15 seconds. So very stupid. It's the dumbest thing I've ever done. And I taught myself that I'm not working with HOTS. So I don't. But anyway, I can attest to the fact that was a little one. I don't know what the hell would happen if a big one, an adult was able to grab you. So I did want to attest to the fact that I would consider these things hot. I would not be treating them like a corn snake or a king snake or anything because that is the most intense, I guess, venomous interaction I've had with a snake ever. And it was from an Oxyrhynchus. So that was less than 2 months old. So there it is. Treat him with respect. And don't be a dumbass like me. So anyway. All righty. Are there any final thoughts you have for this wonderful, wonderful group of snakes? And congrats on getting them to to reproduce. Well, I do have one question. What temp did you incubate the eggs at?
I kept them at room temps too, but then it started getting... I started second guessing myself given how warm the animals like it and the time of year that I got mine, and it was starting to cool down. So I did end up putting them in an incubator set to 82.
Okay. And then no surprises. Nothing on
No surprises. They all hatched out fine. Now, when they were laid, I will say they had no veins to them whatsoever, and I thought they were duds. But I decided to just set them up anyways and give them some time just in case. And a week later, they had become fully veined and everything.
Oh, that's cool.
So if you do get into these enough that you have gotten them to breeding and you get eggs, don't just candle them immediately, see no veins and be like, duds, and throw them out. Give them actual time to vein up. Look for... As the crested gecko people call it, look for the Cheerio of life. There's a slight little ring at the top of the egg, and I saw that on all of them, and that was what kind of convinced me of this could actually be good viable eggs. They just need a little more time to vein up, and yeah, that's exactly what happened.
Nice. So on that, any final thoughts on Ramphiophis for the audience? Summation.
Again, don't go holding them because not smart. Try to keep socially, and definitely cage keep them because they will do so much better. I would dare say even go larger than you think. There's a part of me that wants to take my 1.1 and try to get them in something like a 6-foot cage, just because I know they would use every square inch of it because they use every square inch of that 4-foot cage.
Very cool.
They're fun and fascinating little animals, definitely more active and different than a lot of the things you see out there.
So if people are looking for an active snake for a naturalistic xeric desert-like setup, this might be the high
These
up
would be
there.
the ones, yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Don't overfeed them. These ones overfeed very easy too. Small meals, they'll burn through them, but don't just keep pumping them full of rats and rats and rats because they will get fat, and a fat beaked snake is almost as ugly as a fat kukri. They're not appealing. I do a lot of diet diversity for these guys. They'll get a hopper, they'll get a chicken neck, they'll eat chicken hearts, they'll eat tilapia, they will eat just about anything.
Very cool. All right. Well, I think we did it. Are we good? I'd say we're good.
I'm good.
All right.
Yeah.
So well, first and foremost, you have a podcast, sir. Do you want to talk a little bit about your podcast? That'll mean something here in a second.
So myself, James Lewis, and Jason Miloradovich do the Pint-Sized Reptiles podcast. We tend to focus on smaller species because it seems a lot of the hobby is focused on, kind of the larger animals and things that go in tubs because, they're bigger and you don't really have the mentality of the small side of things here other than, like every once in a while you hear about the dart frogs and things. But we decided to kind of focus on those smaller things, dart frogs, day geckos, rubber boas, things that do well in smaller and naturalistic style enclosures, things that you might be able to keep, in your bedroom, in your living room, on your desk, so that you can have that little piece of nature rather than just snake in box. Even the way a lot of people keep in, 4-foot cages, if you've got a python in a 4-foot cage, most people aren't keeping that in like a bioactive or a naturalistic type cage. It's still just a fairly Spartan thing. So the focus is on that. Now we do, kind of diverge here and there in terms of pint sized. Like we did an episode which was very different from what I had gone into it with, but we talked a lot about turtles, and, even a small turtle needs a lot more space than, a smaller snake or a smaller frog would. But a small turtle that requires a lot of space is not the same as a sulcata.
Yeah.
So, looking at smaller turtles is still an option if you want to do a turtle. It's not a turtle you can keep in a 10-gallon tank, but a turtle that you can keep, on a 6 foot by 6 foot turtle table in your house is a lot better than having to deal with a sulcata that's going to tear up your entire basement and destroy your toilet like Patrick McKnight's sulcata did. So we look at things like that.
Awesome. No, definitely plan on checking that one out. I've got a lot of podcasts listening coming up, and I like to line them up and then just kind of like you do with a Netflix series, just basically listen to all of them in a row. So
yeah, I'm happy that, the whole NPR and most of the THP pods are available on YouTube, because that's about the only way I get through everything that I need. Is those ones are on at work, and I just, have my earbuds in while I'm at my desk, or I've just got them cranked up when I'm sitting there in the hood and the computer's behind me. I can listen to them that way. Because if I was only reliant on the time, driving to and from work or when I'm home on the weekends, I would never get through all the podcasts.
All right. If people want to find you to talk kukri or beaked snake, how do you recommend
you can find me on Facebook. I'm Travis Wyman. I am not the motocross racer who spells his name the same way as me. So please don't message him asking about snakes. I'm sure he, one, will not know what you're talking about, and two, probably won't appreciate it very much. You can email me, asplundii, ASPLUNDII @gmail.com. Or you can find me on Instagram at snakes_n_bakes.
There we go. I'm certain people, if we didn't pique people's interest in these two snakes or snake genera with this one, I don't know what we need to do. So this was a great one. So thank you for coming on, Travis. We appreciate having you.
Not a problem. Thank you for having me, gentlemen.
Certain we will have you on in the future. If people want to find me, you can find me on Facebook at Zach Loafman, LOUGHMAN. You can also find me on Instagram at Dr. Crawdad. And if you're, I'm going to say, I keep saying it. I'm just going to keep saying it. And all of us went to grad school, so we all know this experience. Anybody wants to do herpetoculture for a master's degree, please, for the love of God, hit me up. We're looking to take on more students, and the facilities at West Liberty just keep getting better and better to do this kind of research, and the future is bright. That is all I have to say on that front. And then I do want to say one more time. Go ahead.
I was going to say, with all the stuff that gets talked about on THP and Snakes and Stogies and NPR, I think those guys are coming up with more and more projects that they want to see you and your crew do. So you need those bodies to pull off these experiments.
No, I listen to podcasts and I'll hear like, oh wow, Loafman can do that, and then I'm sitting here thinking, all I need are the warm bodies, and we can start cranking this stuff out. So, and then on that same token, we would like to, Matt and I, thank NPR Network for hosting our podcast, which is definitely a 2-hour break from our busy lives that we absolutely love recording. So on that token, Matt, where can people find you?
You can follow Serpamitra on Facebook and Serpamitra USA on Instagram.
All righty. So with that being said, thank you for listening. And be it day, night, morning, have a good one. Later, y'all.